Welcome to our final session of the semester. And for today's session, we have Dr. Alexandra Freeman from Cambridge University and Tim Fellows from Jisc. And they are going to introduce Octopus, which is a new research publishing platform. Octopus is a new platform that is being designed to help researchers share their work in a way that is fast, free, as well as fair. It aims to be a place where you can link all your research outputs together, your hypotheses, your methods, your results, your analysis, and you can get peer reviews. This project is being funded by UKRI and it is in partnership with UK Reproducibility Network, and it works with other existing repositories and systems to make sure that you as a researcher get credit for everything that you share on Octopus. Now I will hand over to our today's speakers now.
Thank you very much. You've done practically all my talk in sort of 10 seconds. So I'm just doing the awkward bit where I'm now trying to share. Hopefully you can now see my slides. Do shout if you can't. So yes, thank you very much. It's lovely to speak to you today. I came back to academia. I am at Cambridge at the moment, but I was for 15 years a filmmaker at the BBC. So I came back to academia and it really struck me as I came back as a PI leading a research team, how much the publishing system really kind of controlled the careers of the postdocs in my group, the research assistants, everybody. It's felt like the whole aim of their research lives was to get papers, and the papers, this was a system that was really controlling the incentives in a way that is unhealthy. So I came up with the idea of Octopus as a way of solving what seemed to me to be some fundamental problems. And really what I thought is that we need to be, the whole point of doing research is to try and find answers to some of the important questions and problems around us. And we should be doing that in a way that allows us to get to answers as quickly as possible and implement, useful findings off the back of that research as fast as possible. And that researchers should be really rewarded for doing the best possible research work, whatever kind of research they're doing, and not really just being incentivized to write papers. Because it seems that the whole concentration on what you're really trying to produce is a paper that will be published in a, quotes, high impact journal, is driving research at a very fundamental level in the direction that isn't taking us towards what we are actually aiming to do, which is to solve problems as quickly as possible and efficiently as possible. And I think that comes down to what is important in a journal article. What are we incentivizing? And so this is a typical example of what journals ask of their authors. It's taken from one of the leading science journals, Guide for Authors. And there's a couple of phrases in there which I think you'll all recognize as defining that classic high impact publication. If you look at what they're trying to maximize, it's a piece of writing that carries a focused message in order to gain impact through readership, through citations. And coming from the media, coming from a world where we are trying to entertain people, that is very familiar to me, but it doesn't seem to me that scientists and researchers in general should be being incentivized in the same way as someone working in an entertainment medium. Other guides that you'll read talk about streamlined narratives and making your point. And I think here we have to think about what good research actually leads to. And it's not always a good story and something that people want to read. So I think fundamentally we have a problem with the current system, both the publication system and the whole kind of scholarly research system, because journals and journal articles are being pulled in different directions. They're trying to do a job of disseminating findings a bit like I was in the world of television, which is a really important job. You know, it's one that drives the revenue of a lot of journals, but it's also, you know, the most popular bits of journals, the news and views, and it is reaching people who can do something with the research findings. But the aim for things to be attractive and readable drives things like word counts, publication bias, a lot of the questionable research practices that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And at the same time, journals are being kind of forced to fulfill this other job of being a kind of patent office for establishing priority, a place to record the full detail of all the methods and the data and the analysis that goes on in a research world. And that's actually a really specialized kind of communication. If you're making something readable, you don't want to describe things in full detail, or things that didn't work, or extra analyses to check for robustness, or protocols that haven't been carried out yet, or even talk about all your uncertainties and limitations. But these all should be in the primary research record. And I think that this function of being the research record is kind of being sacrificed as journals bend towards being the disseminators. And it's natural that they would. But these two things are really different and they're in conflict with each other. And so I think one of the particular problems of this is because if researchers themselves are being assessed and judged on the outputs of a journal and their papers, then the incentive structure that is built around dissemination is actually really not the best incentive structure for assessment for researchers. And so, you know, you're being judged instead of on how robustly and how in depth you did your research, you're being assessed on how well you are selling a story to the readership. So fundamentally, I think the answer is to split these two jobs. And that's what Octopus is. It's designed, as it says, to be the new primary research record, to take on that second job and leave journals free to do their first job properly. So they become the disseminators, and then we in Octopus can become the place where it's the record of everything that's done in full detail so that it's all there for others to build on and learn from. And then that means that the research record, the primary research record, can also be the main place that research assessment gets done, because you should be being judged on something that's published in full, so we can see everything that you've done and how you've done it. So Octopus then is designed to maximize access to primary research because it's free. So everybody can read what's in there. You can publish in there without any sort of financial barriers. But it's also designed to overcome barriers in lots of other senses as well. So automatic language translation is going to be in there soon, so that it doesn't, you know, you've not got a barrier to publishing just because English isn't your first language. And it's also built around a different system, so that papers, these narrative summaries, are not the unit of publication, because I think that this actually drives so many of the questionable research practices. And I think the reason for that is because although the research process naturally comes in a series of steps that you do one after the other, and you may not do all of them. You know, if you're a theorist, you may be only doing the first two parts in that process. If you are a person who specializes in real world work, then maybe you're concentrating towards the end of that process. But each step has different skills, it has different resource requirements, and different people often do them. And you're essentially forcing people to get to their endpoint in that process before they share any of it. And you're retrospectively forcing a linear narrative onto what is not always a linear process. I mean, we all know that there tend to be cycles within this and branches within this. You know, you might do multiple analyses, you might have pilot studies, you might record lots of different kinds of results before you do any analysis. Things don't work and you restart them. So in a primary research record where we're not trying to create a linear, nice story that is selling an idea, we can have a structure of the publication that actually more closely matches what people are really doing. And not just what an individual is doing, but what a whole research community is doing. So each publication type, and you can see there are 7 here, is linked to the one before it in the chain. So you can't publish data, excuse me, without publishing the protocol by which that data was collected, so that it makes sure that we're incentivizing people to share everything as much as possible, as fully as possible, and allowing other people to use that work so it becomes useful. It's not just data thrown into a repository, uncleaned, no metadata. But this structure also is a bit like registered reports, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in terms of breaking the link between what the findings are and how good the research is. Because good research based on a really, well-designed protocol and good hypotheses, theory, is good regardless of what the outcomes and the findings are. So no longer do you have to have, you're under pressure to have results that tell a good story. You're now being incentivized just to publish things that are of the highest intrinsic quality in each unit. So this, you will have noticed there were 7 types of research publication. Octopus, of course, meaning 8. There are 8 types of publication within Octopus, and the 8th type is a review, a peer review. Because a peer review in Octopus is treated like any other kind of publication. They can be linked to any type of publication, of course. And so a peer review in Octopus is something a bit different from the kind of peer review that is almost treated like a gatekeeper to publication. Instead, you can get reviews of hypotheses, you can get reviews of protocols, you can get reviews of data. They're instead a useful critique, either constructive criticism or just, qualitative praise for how something's been done. And they're published publicly, and you get as much credit for publishing a good review as you would for publishing any other type of publication. So it makes reviewing something different from what it is at the moment. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So I would just want to talk briefly before Tim shows you Octopus, how the design of Octopus is really conceptualized to improve the reproducibility, replicability, but also the research culture and the experience for all of us as researchers. So firstly, there's instant publication. So as soon as you and your co-authors have agreed that you're happy with something, it goes public. So in that respect, it's like a preprint server. And that means that you're getting kind of instant priority. It's date stamped, time stamped. It's there for people to refer to. And it means that knowledge is being disseminated more quickly, just as we saw preprints really taking off during COVID in the sort of psychology and medicine areas. You have smaller author groups for these smaller types of publication. And I think that's really important to make sure that you get recognition for what you do. And especially, I think that's important if you're a specialist. And we need more specialists. We all need to be concentrating on the things that we're really good at. You do not want me trying to do quantitative methods. I am not a quantitative methods person. So there's no point, me being an author. Well, I mean, there is a point, but it's not good for me to be an author on a paper where I am signing as an author that I have a full enough understanding to be able to stand behind the quantitative methods used in that paper. I might have designed the protocol, I might have collected the data, but I can't stand behind the analysis. So by splitting up the publications, now I can be an author on the things that I have done and I can stand up for, and other people are getting the credit and standing behind what they've done. And that means as well, I think, that we get a much more open career path for those who are specialized in things like protocol design or analysis. It makes it a very different world, I think, in terms of credit. I've talked about the need for narrative and how that there's this pressure to create a good story and how so many of the questionable research practices like p-hacking and harking that you'll be familiar with, and a lot of the publication bias is driven by the need to make a narrative. But I think it also means that there's so much wasted research out there, small data sets or things where you didn't actually have the resources to go on and collect data that aren't being published, they're not being shared. And we need to be making use of those and people getting credit for that work. Something that I'm very passionate about is this idea that we get equal emphasis on each part of the research process. I think, you know, there was a move towards findings and impact being so incentivized by systems like the REF. And I can see why, because we want our research to be useful. But by putting that emphasis so hard on impact, I think we're now sacrificing the necessary robustness or the incentive for robustness over the incentive for the findings. So I think by rebalancing that and making sure that everybody is assessed on the intrinsic quality of each part of the research process, it means that instead we are each kind of making bricks, instead of building a tower each and trying to get the tallest towers with the most impactful findings, the top of the tower being the important thing. Instead, we're being judged on the robustness of each of our bricks. And we're all putting bricks in the wall together, means that the towers will emerge as an emergent property, but they'll be robust because they'll be on a firm base because the base is being tested. So I think this is really important. The peer review, I said I'd come back to this, and I'm sure you're going to have questions about this, but post-publication peer review, I think, is becoming less controversial. We're becoming more used to it. And I think it's useful because it prevents there being a barrier to publication in the first place. And it changes what we think of as a peer review. It's not a gatekeeper. It's not somebody who's an antagonist to you getting your paper out there. Instead, you're getting your work out there, and a peer review is a helpful a person who is helping you improve that, because you can read other people's reviews, you can make up your own mind based on that, but you as an author can then reversion your publication in the light of that review and say, oh yes, good point, perhaps even include that review as an author on the reversion. So I think it just changes what we think of reviews, and I'm sure people want to talk about that. And we incentivize reviews by recognizing that reviewing is a skill like any other. Research integrity, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but we do have a red flag system within Octopus, because I think it's really important where there are potentially fundamental flaws in a publication or things like plagiarism, that they can be really quickly and transparently flagged. So any reader can raise a red flag, and then that allows other readers to still be able to read the publication, but they know what other people are concerned about. And then that can be resolved sort of in a transparent but also behind the scenes way. So it takes you to a kind of almost like an Amazon dispute resolution center. Other people can read the conversation between the flagger and the authors. So it's transparent, but it's there kind of, hopefully resolving the issues. And so finally, as I said, I hope that this system can help change the way that we approach research, because it allows and in fact encourages specialization, but also hopefully allows this much broader collaboration, because you are publishing, as I said, it's almost like putting the bricks in the wall. You're wondering, where your brick is going. You can build bricks on top of other people's. I don't have to now know the people that I'm going to collaborate with. I can put a piece of work out into Octopus. Anybody, anywhere in the world, and at any time, so 30 years in the future, can build on that piece of research that I put out there. So I think it just changes the way that we'll think about our careers. We'll be able to be more specialist, do the research that we want to do, and not be having to do the bits that we're not so good at or not so keen and not so interested in, and just give us a really different perspective on it. So that is my, as quick as I can, introduction to Octopus. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Tim, who's going to show you the site as it is. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my button. There we go.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Let me just share my own screen and I'll run through this. Here we are. Right. So what you can see here, this is the publication page for a research problem that's been put on Octopus. And I'll just highlight a few things here that I think point to some of the interesting things that the platform's doing to try and create a more collaborative environment, I suppose is the best way to term it. So you can see A. Freeman, no points for guessing who that is, has published a research problem and a hypothesis. And following on from that, there's been separate publications for the method, the results and the analysis, and so on. But down here, one quite important detail of the system, as you mentioned, is this idea that other people can bolt on alternative publications. So in this particular case, A. Freeman has a publication for testing this hypothesis via online surveys, but someone else has also published a method for using interviews to test the same hypothesis. So the idea is that you can have research being taken in two different directions, these two separate strands of a research project, to essentially have different ways to test the same piece of work. And if you wanted to, as this progresses down the research chain, you could even start tying these back together with an interpretation of both analyses in combination to test sort of a wider set of publications.
Hoping to publish that today.
There we go. Yes, I think we had some last-minute technical issues, unfortunately, that have slightly pushed that back. Otherwise, we'd have something exciting there on the end to tie up these multiple threads. But yes, and by having these separate, smaller publications, as you can see here, this one, for instance, is a fairly brief piece. There's nothing too in-depth here. What this means, as Alex mentioned, is if we hop on to, let's say, these results here, or perhaps this analysis, you can see that A. Lawrence here is getting the credit for doing this analysis on this piece of work, I suppose, as a specialist who focuses on that without being sort of, middle of the way through a much longer list of authors. They can get the credit for their specialization. One other important thing to note here, I think, is we try and make sure that biasing factors are removed where possible from the system. So you'll notice that everywhere we refer to an author, we refer to them by their first initial to try and remove the biasing factor of gender and things like that from people's first names, just in case that could skew people's opinions on things. And similarly, we try and avoid putting in mentions of, for instance, the institution that is affiliated with this work, to make sure that people don't have a look at a publication and go, oh, that's an Oxford publication, and have an inherently higher opinion of it than a publication done from somewhere else, perhaps. So I suppose one important note here is you can see how these publications form an interconnected chain, with different ones branching off from each other to create a network of publications. That concept scales up to the entire system. So I suppose it relies on the principle that all human knowledge is, in a way, inherently interconnected, and everything derived from something else. So what Octopus does is, above this first research problem in the system here, there is another research problem, and that continues all the way back up to something we call the God problem, which is essentially a very philosophical question of, I think it's why is everything in the universe the way that it is, and how can we observe it? It's something along those lines, and that ties everything together. And that means that, for instance, if you have a research problem like this one that was actually published this morning, and you're not quite sure where to put it, you can find a series of strands for other places, other pieces of knowledge that this work sort of builds upon, and you can attach it to those to aid discoverability and to showcase I suppose, the derivation of where your work is coming from. So hopefully that means when you're viewing a publication in Octopus, you always have some context on where it sits in the bigger picture of the research landscape.
We're going to have a better visualization of that soon.
Yes, our UX person is going to be very busy coming up with some interesting networks for how to map out all these different connections and things like that. Octopus obviously puts the focus on quality feedback. So there's a few methods for this. We can obviously write a link to review against any publication in the system. And we can also do something called raising a red flag, which is this option here to flag a concern with the publication. So the idea here is if you spot something on a publication that you think is particularly concerning, you can record a sort of official note against this publication to describe what you've seen and why that's a concern. And that will be publicly recorded against this publication to indicate that you have that concern. And it will also open up a dialogue with the authors so that you can start discussing that concern and seeing if there's a way to potentially resolve it. And hopefully through that process, you'll be able to come to a resolution for those concerns and come to a high quality output ultimately. There are a few sort of upcoming features that tie in quite nicely to this. I think I might as well run through them now as part of this demo. So in particular, for this case of raising a red flag on a particular concern you have and trying to resolve it, we're going to introduce a system called reversioning, which is essentially being able to publish a new version of an existing publication and being able to switch between the new and the old version to see what's changed, making sure that we still have accountability for what went on the initial version, but now seeing the latest state of that publication. And the idea is that could be used in combination with this feature and with peer reviews and things like that to refine a publication into something hopefully of higher quality, and perhaps to include anything new that's come up that should be added to that publication as you go. Which means, in theory, we can start pitching Octopus as the place to refine your publications as well as get them out there and get credits and things like that. And second, and I think equally important for us, is the quality rating system, which is a fairly big piece in itself. The idea is, and if I hop back over to a tab where we can see more publications here, each of these publication types that you can see listed across the top would have 3 different metrics against it. Each of these metrics could be scored on a 1 to 5 scale by any reader, and those metrics would be they'd be different for each publication. So for instance, we haven't settled on exactly what these would be yet, but perhaps for a data set it could be that the data is properly annotated, that it's freely available, and well, I suppose a third one, it's not coming to mind at the moment.
importance to the topic, I think, was
yes,
the third
yes,
one
relevance, something along those lines.
Yeah. And can I just jump in, because I think this is really important, the rating system, because as I was saying, if this can become the place where research assessment is based, it means that we can design metrics that absolutely capture what we think good means. And so instead of having things like impact factor, we can now have ratings of reproducibility, of clarity, of whatever we think as a community good means in each of these publication types, including reviews, of course. And so we are currently consulting on what those 3 criteria should be for each publication type, because, I mean, we built the system in the first place, but we didn't want to launch it and then discover that we'd created a bad incentive system by having a metric system that, you know, didn't necessarily work across all fields or all disciplines. So we are we're currently consulting on those at the moment. I'm sure Tim can tell you more. Sorry, Tim.
Yeah, no, that's all right, thanks. Yeah, so essentially the idea is we build up an objective measure of, I suppose to use a very broad word in this case, the quality of a publication that we can use as both sort of a score against that publication, and also in theory as an alternative to what a lot of online systems do, where they rank things based upon popularity. So in your Google search results, for instance, it's how many times people click it. We can instead start looking at making sure that in our search results, quality is perhaps something that you can sort your results by, again, to try and promote high quality publications across the system. But we need to make sure that those metrics are absolutely watertight. Obviously, if we have some ambiguous wording somewhere, if we have a measure that isn't entirely relevant or doesn't entirely encapsulate a good quality publication, that leaves us with a bit of a problem, because we're getting people to score things on a metric that doesn't necessarily make sense for that type of publication. So at the moment, we're, as Alex said, consulting with the community to make sure that we come up with the right metrics for each of these publication types. So if that is something you'd be interested in getting involved with, please put a message in the chat, and I'll be happy to pick that up with you and bring you in on some of those discussions, because we're very keen to hear from absolutely everyone we can really on that topic in particular. Before I dive into a quick run through of how people actually use the system to publish and that sort of workflow, is there anything else we ought to make note of here?
I think if you click on my name there, and or John's actually the next one along, and I'll just talk through. There's a question in the chat about about verification of people using it, especially, you know, for reviewing and that kind of thing. And yes, you have to log on using your ORCID. And so that provides some level of identification, I guess. for individuals using Octopus. So the idea is that you can't do anything anonymous on Octopus. Everything's linked to your profile and everything is visible. So as you can see on my colleague, there's personal page, you can see all of his non-Octopus publications, all of his Octopus publications, and we will have some graphics that also kind of summarize those. But you'll be able to see the ratings, you'll be able to see who has rated whom, who has reviewed whom, and people will be able to pull out that information. It's all freely available on APIs so that you can see if there are circles of bad practice, you know, people rating their mates, that kind of thing will all become transparent and obvious and will be able to be, you know, picked up by research integrity officers or institutions or whoever. And another question on there is about, which I think is relevant here, is because you're logging in with ORCID, and also as you publish, when Tim shows you that, you have to, you talk about your affiliations and that kind of thing. That is all because Octopus does talk at the back end to institutional repositories and can be used for all the kind of reporting. We're trying to make sure that everything links to all the reporting systems. So as you say, that both incentivizes the use of Octopus, but also perhaps allows Octopus to take on the public service version of some of the commercial operators that provide these services to institutions at the moment, mentioning no brands. So hopefully it will be useful and also is incentivizing best practice because it's, as I say, built around this whole thing about intrinsic quality being best. Right, back to you, Tim.
Thanks. Okay, so I will hop over to our test site now, and I'll just quickly have a run through of the publishing process so you can see a little bit of how that looks. So let me hop onto this tab. I've kept the color theme different just to make sure that I don't accidentally publish on the live site, which would be a mistake. And here we are. So I'll log in with my ORCID account, as just mentioned. Give that a moment.
Of course, it's going to be really slow because you're running Teams at the same time.
Yes, yes. And I think it's just the law of demoing, as things always run slower as soon as you try and show it off. So here we are. And what I'll do is there are two ways to initiate publishing. So the first is if you go onto an existing publication of any form, you get some options down here. So for instance, if I was looking at, let's say at this analysis here, and I think that there's another question that's being posed as part of this analysis, which needs to, it justifies its own strand of research, perhaps. I could come down here and I could write a linked research problem, and I could detail, giving credit to the authors of this analysis here, this new problem that's stemming off from that to start its own research chain. I can also write things like the next step in the chain of publications here, so I could interpret this analysis here. And I can obviously write a review against any type of publication in the system. The alternative way to do to initiate a new publication is simply to head over to the publish page here. So if I hop onto here, it's going to take me through a bit of guidance about the sort of publication that I'm going to be creating. And it also asks me to put in a title. So let me just put in that nice creative publication name. And let's hop into the process. Right, so here we are on our publishing process. There's a few different steps we'll need to run through. First of all, we have our license type. That's just CC by 4, meaning it's open access, as you know. And then we have our affiliations to add in. So these affiliations are pulled directly from your ORCID profile. Anything that you have listed on there will be pulled through to here so that you don't need to go back and re-enter the same information multiple times here as you've already got it on your ORCID profile. So all I need to do, if this publication is affiliated with Jisc, is I'll whack that in there, and that's now listed against the publication. Next up, we need to make sure that we've attached it to something else in the system. So as I said, everything in the system is interconnected, so it is mandatory to have this publication attached to at least one other piece in the system. For the purpose of this, I think I will be rather uncreative and just...
This is the hardest thing. A lot of people come and say, I don't know where to attach it. If you're worried about that, do just email us and we'll help find something. But there are essentially, we've put in these very high level research topics. So there's things like medicine. If you're desperate, you can attach it to that. But usually below that, there are a couple of levels. But if you find that there's a level, you know, somebody the other day wanted computational genealogies or something like that, just email us and we'll create it for you so that you can attach it.
Yes, and I'll just touch on that quickly to show you. So I mentioned about everything being interconnected, and you can attach your publications to previous items. Here is the aforementioned God problem, as we call it. It's very philosophical, top level. And from here, if you are struggling to find somewhere to attach your work, you can come to this problem here, and you will see the Library of Congress classification structure below that, modeled in research problems that you can then dig into to find exactly where you want to attach it. So let's say I hop into medicine. Below this, we'll see various disciplines within medicine, and if we hop into one, go into general, we'll see a few specific research problems below that, and so on, digging down and getting more granular with each stage until we come to actual specific research problems. So at the point where it's not a specific question to be answered, if you like, but rather an area, you'll have just a high level item like this to attach it to if something doesn't already exist in the system to bolt it onto. For now, we'll use this problem here. We'll say it's derived from this item about spray nozzles. So let me link that in there, and we'll move on to the main text. So this is fairly straightforward. It's just a standard text editor. I can pop something in here to make sure that I've got a publication body, and then I can come in here and add my references. So I don't have anything prepped for this. Let me see if I can find something very quickly. Okay, I'm just going to drop this in here for now. So what this will do, imagine you've got a Word document with a list of all of your references in there or something like that, and you want to make sure that they're properly formatted in the system and that the system is reading what the DOIs are and things like that. All you need to do is drop them into this box and hit add, and it will pull you out a list of each reference separately with its DOI and things like that, ready for you to either delete it individually, edit individually, or add new ones to that list. So hopefully this is just a bit of a time saver to get your unformatted Word document into a nice structured list with metadata that we can then use to do things like log it against our data site records. So next up, I don't think we need to worry too much about the description and keywords. That's essentially just for making sure the search can find your publication. Conflict of interest, obviously, if you have a conflict of interest in this publication, you can enter it here. Funders, here you can enter some details about any funding you've received for the publication, whether that's via the raw ID or by typing in some details manually. And then next up, we have the co-authors feature. So there's actually a workflow here in itself. We wanted to make sure that if you have a co-author added to this publication, you're not going to be able to publish something with their name on it without giving them a chance to come in and have a look and make sure they're happy with it. So if I add this co-author here, what you see is this button up here saying publish will change to request approval. And what that means now is to have this person listed against this publication, I need to get their permission. So I hit this button up here and I'll send a request over to my co-author. And what this will do is this will dispatch an email over to that address that I just entered to invite them to come onto the system and take a look and tell me whether or not they're happy with the publication.
Because it's going to be very slow for you now.
Yes, the test site's always doing this. There we go. Right, that's just come through. And there we go. So now we're on a page where we can monitor what's going on with this publication, including the status of our co-authors. Here we can see our other author, and we have a few options for sending them reminders, changing their email if we've mistyped it and things like that. But as it is, I've got that email through because I have managed to type my own email address successfully. So as the other user, I'm just going to accept the email invitation and log in, and we'll get to a new screen where we can review this publication and make sure we're happy with it. So here we are. I can have a look through the publication, make sure I'm happy with it, and then I hit this approve button up here, give it my sign off, and there we go. Now if I'm back on our corresponding authors page, the person who's actually creating the publication in the system, you'll see that this is updated to let me publish. I've just had an email through saying everyone's approved this, so you're messaged at each step of the process to make sure that you know when your other authors are coming in here and giving it their thumbs up. And now the last step is just for me to hit this button here and get this published. And there we have it. It's as simple as that. So this was obviously a very brief publication. There'll be a little bit more work in formatting, but hopefully this process is nice and easy to follow and fairly quick to mean that you don't have to spend loads of time building out a very complicated in-depth publication when you can just get something on here like your research problem fairly quickly. And you can see down here I've got my DOI against this now, so I can reference this elsewhere. Yes, I think that's about it. There's anything else to delve into too much depth there, unless you had anything, Alex?
No, we've got people asking questions in the chat, so I think we should open it up for any questions that anyone has.
Brilliant.
I'll just stop the recording now. Thanks for giving the presentation. That was really great.